Yes. I was educated during the 39-45 war in a day school in London, and during that time the teaching program got compressed through the fact that most children were evacuated, and those who stayed in London had fewer teachers. And suddenly I found myself at the age of 13 being in the sixth form of the school, 2 years ahead of my time. I missed 2 years of education because they were condensing the condensing the curriculum through shortage of teachers. And so I had to decide at the age of 15 what normally I would have decided at the age of 17. I lost 2 years of education, and I had no idea what to do. I thought I'd like to go to university. I had enough credits to get a place in Cambridge, and my brother, who was 4.5 years older than me, was already studying medicine, and I had an uncle who had died, who was a doctor, but my family were, my father and mother were immigrants from Eastern Europe after the First World War, and I grew up in a very non-academic background, but I thought, well, I'll follow my brother. So I went to Cambridge and studied medicine.
And why nephrology? When?
Pardon me?
And nephrology.
Nephrology. Well, that's a long story. I was trained actually to be by a rather unusual person who was the first full female professor of medicine in the United Kingdom. Her name was Sheila Sherlock, and I was senior house officer and then registrar to her at the postgraduate medical school in Hammersmith, and the professor was McMichael at the time. This was after I'd done my military service in Nigeria. I came back and was a registrar for her in liver disease, and she became the first full female professor of medicine in the United Kingdom when she got the post at the Royal Free Hospital in London. And I was interested in circulatory measurements by dye dilution technology, and really wasn't interested in nephrology. In fact, nephrology didn't exist at that particular moment in time, the word. And I followed her and was interested in doing organ blood flows in different parts of the body, with no interest in clinical medicine really at all, other than what you had to do. And she decided, after the first International Congress of Nephrology, which she sent me to, where I gave a paper on how to measure renal blood flow by injecting a dye into the renal artery and measuring the effluent dilution in the renal vein, which we published in the Experimental Journal of Medicine. She said, no, you can't stay in gastroenterology and liver disease. You are to become a nephrologist. So that's how I got into nephrology. That's probably not. Probably not, I would think. I think if I had been left alone, I would have gone back to the postgraduate medical school and ended my days doing experimental medicine on humans. She was a rather aggressive lady and used to use a lot of people who got very good medical care but were getting on in age as elderly human controls for diseased circulatory states. And this kind of potentially unethical medicine attracted me, to be honest, and I think I'd have stayed in that rather than gone into something as clinical as nephrology. That's a very difficult question to answer that. Do you mean in medicine?
Yeah.
Well, what struck me as being very interesting was the concept of self-treatment, that you could inspire in somebody who had a potentially fatal disease. And there are certain people who you wanted to create a sense of independence rather than dependence. And the field that I ended up in, which was not my choice, was nephrology. And I went to the first International Congress in Nephrology and became a lecturer in nephrology at the Royal Free Hospital when my professor got a full professorship there, was to motivate people in chronic disease who were very dependent because they depended upon a nurse and a doctor to provide the dialysis therapy for them, that my interest was that to make them totally independent, to be able to do this themselves, alone, in the house, living alone, without anybody in the house, overnight. And we did this in exceptional human beings. Was a German patient who was a bachelor, living alone in a small house in the north of Germany, and he dialyzed for 38 years, totally alone, overnight. Did everything. And was a remarkable individual. Now, it required a lot of brainwashing to get him to be able to do this, and I don't think you can do this in everybody with dialysis, but the dream was to make dialysis the insulin of the chronic nephritic, and of course it has gone backwards, in my opinion. It hasn't gone forwards into that at all. I mean, CAPD has kind of stepped in, and people can do this sort of, dare I say it, second-class treatment for second-class patients, but done by first-class nurses. That's how I would describe CAPD. But the dependency of the dialysis patient has become established today. The dream of it being the insulin of the chronic nephritic has disappeared. She was a remarkably almost schizophrenic lady, because as a human being she was married, she had children, she was at home. When you got through her stern, obdurate sort of professional, you found a charming housewife who actually looked after 2 children and had a husband who was the boss. But at work she was almost schizophrenic. This was a different woman. And if you were invited to her house and saw her in her natural environment, you appreciated her much more. Well, my problem is that I'm conceited, to be perfectly honest, and that makes teaching of people who are perhaps not quick on the uptake, shall we say, or a bit more stupid than others. I don't have the patience for that type of person, to be perfectly honest, so I'm not a very good teacher. Oh, for those that I respected, a good one, and for those that I had little regard for, big turnover, very bad. Not a good guy to be a sort of tolerant teacher, very intolerant of idiots. Well, it depends, really. I think that's a very difficult question to answer. I certainly, in my sort of old age now, realize that I could have done much more creative work and where I'm more tolerant. And I made many mistakes and ended up ruining my academic career in England because of it, you know. I mean, if you are insulting to your chief, like I was to my professor, first female full professor of medicine in the United Kingdom, you don't have a future in the United Kingdom. And when my time as a lecturer of 5 years at the hospital finished, I was the only applicant for a proper post of full consultant, and no suitable person applied for the job. So I guess that I didn't fit into the English academic system. I was always perhaps too arrogant or too intolerant, but whatever. So I left the health service and decided to take the health service on and opened a private dialysis clinic where you could buy your life in socialist Britain under the draconian rules of Mr. Wilson. This was not very well tolerated by the government, but and in the end it was quite interesting actually, because we would teach the patients how to go out and appeal for money to fund themselves in socialist Britain with a full national health service, how to get money to get dialysis, which the health service was not providing. It was didn't go down too well with the Ministry of Health, but it was nice, it was satisfactory, and we did succeed in that. And then you know, you get bored with doing this after a time. Dialysis is really quite a boring, repetitive subject, and so I wanted to get out of it. So I did a deal with the health service. They said, okay, we'll put the patients back in the home and we'll close down. And we didn't take an English patient after that. We just took them from all over the world instead, you see, and put patients as far east as Ceylon into Africa, and colonized a lot of Germany. Put about 40 patients in the home in Germany. And the insurance companies, and in Sweden and Norway, were paying. So this was quite a profitable time of dialysis, but in the end it got very boring. And I wanted to go back into academic medicine, and so I decided to get out of this center, which was a private center, and apply for a job in the health service. And I applied for about 3 or 4 jobs. We're now in about the early 70s, and no way, Jose. So I realized that if I wanted to go on practicing academic medicine, I better get out of England. And so I got a visiting professorship in Montpellier and came to France, and that's why I stayed there ever since, until I retired. Uh-huh. Okay. Yes. Well, you'll have to join this in somewhere for logic. It was very fashionable in academic medicine in the United Kingdom to have a BTA, which was Been to America. And so during my time at the Royal Free Hospital, where I was still a lecturer in medicine, it was suggested that perhaps I should go to America, and this was about 1963 time, and I went initially to Cleveland and worked with Kolff. Kolff was an impossible man to work with, and clearly, I mean, he had a lot of he's an interesting man, but there was no discipline in terms of scientific activities with Kolff. It was all basically sort of engineering, but not scientific medicine, and original ideas were not tolerated if they didn't come from Dr. Kolff himself. He was a very egocentric man. I think I am an egocentric man, and so there was a clash of personalities, and I didn't find myself working with Dr. Kolff for very long, actually. I was told to get out, and so I left. That was my experience with America. I went then to Seattle for a short time and I'd heard Belding Scribner give his talk in 1960 at the first International Congress of Nephrology. In fact, I think he gave it at Evian, not in Geneva. There was half the meeting was in France and the other half was in Switzerland. And I was very impressed by his determination. It was not his scientific contribution that impressed me. It was more his stubbornness and determination that came through when he presented his data at the first International Congress of Nephrology in 1960. And so when I found myself more or less without an academic future, you don't do with your professor what I did in the Royal Free Hospital, expect to survive. I decided to contact Kolff, and he said okay, and after about 3 months I walked out of Cleveland. I mean, you could not work with Kolff unless you had this sort of adulatory, almost, dare I say, sort of sepoy attitude towards a god, because this man was obsessive in the arrangement of everything in his room. And if somebody had been in the room and moved a pencil or smoked a cigarette, there was all hell let loose until it was discovered, and then he would tell you that you were not allowed to do this in his area of the establishment. And so I left Kolff, as I said, and wandered over to Seattle and was very impressed with what Scribner was doing in 1964, and thought, well, I'll come back, and I came back and started to do dialysis the way that Scribner was doing it rather than the way that I was using a twin coil kidney and a big tank. We went over to the Kiel dialyzers, and they were difficult to get, very expensive. You had to get an import license at the time. This was socialist Britain. They didn't like you spending their money on bits of plastic. But we found a gentleman whose wife needed dialysis, and he could machine these polypropylene boards, and he made our Kiel dialyzers for us. And so we got involved at that time with the industrial processing as well as with the actual clinical implementation. And this was rather important because at this time there was clearly a big division between what was commercially available, largely through two companies, one of which was Travenol, who had a rotating, a drum rather, and the company in France that was making a rotating dialyzer from the Neckar. And the Kiel dialyzer, which came from Norway originally, was not a success in Scandinavia or northern Germany at all, but it was a success because of the modifications in the design made by an engineer in the Department of Engineering in Seattle that Scribner was using, and this really made everything much easier. The Kiel dialyzer at that time became a low resistance dialyzer. You didn't need a blood pump, and this permitted us to go on to overnight dialysis with very little monitoring. The monitoring we had was just in those days you had a pressure monitor which was always designed to work with a blood pump. So it was only interested if the pressure went up, it cut the blood pump. And so I got an engineer to put a low on it because we were interested in passive flow dialysis, where if the blood pressure dropped due to hypotension, you would get a drop in the flow and you wanted an alarm. So we introduced a new monitor, which was a high-low pressure monitor, which I think we were the first to design, actually. It got made by a company that was not involved in dialysis at all. But I think it's a standard on all the dialysis machines today, a high-low pressure monitor. So that was creative a little bit. And the passive flow system with the dialyzer, low volume, enabled us to go into unattended overnight dialysis, which the Americans weren't doing. I think we were the first people to, either in the hospital didn't know, or at home, somebody totally alone in the house dialyzing overnight. And this was quite successful. In fact, there was a German guy from North Germany who did this for 38 years. And the last 10 years he got tired of getting it all ready, so he married a dialysis nurse to do it. But for 20 odd years he did this by himself, completely alone at home overnight. But this kind of dream that this would be the insulin of the chronic nephritic has really gone out of the window now. It doesn't exist anymore, I'm afraid to say. But that's my opinion anyway. Scribner was well, he was a believer. He wasn't a cynic. He was intense. He was a religious man as well. He didn't like you swearing, and we got on very well actually, but he was obsessive to the nth degree about everything, and I think that's why he was successful in it. But he was out of dialysis. he was a charming man. I used to go, he lived on a houseboat with his wife, but in the dialysis unit of the laboratory, he was far too serious, in my opinion. But probably because of him, dialysis is where it is today. I don't think there's any doubt about the fact that his approach was right, and you really needed an obsessive, detailed man to put it there. And I think the fact that passive flow and the Scribner shunt are now historical entities is of interest, because the access site, which is very interesting, this from a historical point of view. As I told you, I was interested in catheters, and so when we started dialysis, we had no money, and buying a Scribner shunt cost a fortune. So we had this technology of puncturing arteries and veins to do blood flows across dilution technology that I told you. So it was a piece of cake to go into puncturing arteries and veins for dialysis. And that's what we did. We punctured the femoral artery and punctured the femoral vein and left them in. We even had an Italian guy who had a brilliant device. It was a capillary tubing with asbestos fiber in it, which you could attach to the catheter and blow it up, because it was silicone rubber tubing, and you put a cork in, and this would perfuse the catheter between dialyses without a pump, simply by the pressure, and would be sterile as it was going through an asbestos filter. It was an Italian invention which we adopted for home dialysis, and had the patients walking around with a little sort of suspender belt and a bag which held these in their strapped to the thigh, so they maintained the patency of the and you could do this, open yourself with a clamp, and so you could do single-handed dialysis, dialysis single-handed by using both hands to hook yourself up. And I think that that is the concept of dialysis being the insulin of the chronic nephritic is a dream. This is a demanding exercise with high blood flows, short time. It's a service industry now. You walk in, get your dialysis, and walk out again. So in that sense, it probably cannot be the insulin of the chronic nephritic, but it provides people with maintenance of life of a reasonable quality at a horrendous cost, which governments pay for, because it's now obligato. You know, you can't let your chronic nephritics die any longer. You have to pay for them, and it's very expensive. Home dialysis has gone. I doubt even the Queen would do it in Buckingham Palace now. Why ruin your home when you can get it done for you with the whole concept is out of the window now. It's all dependent. Well, as I say, I was having I had a goddess called Sheila Sherlock, who I worked for at the Hammersmith Hospital as a postgraduate medical school, and then I was sent to the punishment station of the British Army. Nobody volunteered to go to 10 miles inland from Lagos in a below sea level, 100% humidity village called Yaba, where there was a military hospital. You didn't volunteer, you had to have done something wrong, and I was one of the last intake of higher qualified doctors that the army got. So I should have been in London for a posting, but unfortunately I and the army didn't get on. And so, faute de mieux, I was, you know, they used to have stupid rules, and we were in a very elegant Royal Army Medical Corps mess with Colonel Blimps, who were professional doctors in the Royal Army Medical Corps, and it was a beautiful old house with an overlooking the Thames, and you had a key because the mess door was locked at 10 o'clock. But we were National Service medical officers, didn't get a key, you see. And so we had to be in by 10 o'clock. And dare I say it, we were all members of the FTA. Can I say what the FTA stands for? It was called Fuck the Army, you see. And, well, it's true. I mean, and I had learned how to climb in trained at Cambridge. The door was always shut at 10 o'clock. You had to learn how to climb over the spikes to get in through the kitchen door if you wanted to get into your college. That was traditional. So I knew that the door would be locked. I went back to my old hospital, Middlesex, and was moderately intoxicated. And the Royal Army Medical Corps mess was adjacent to a sort of training ground, which was a big parade area where you learned how to march and so on. And it had railings all round it, and a guard room. And the guard room wouldn't let you in after 10 o'clock, it was shut. So I thought, well, I've done this at Cambridge many times. I climbed over the railing and slipped, so that I still have the scars here. The spike went through my thigh. Well, that was all right. I pulled off my thigh, went back to where I should have gone in with, and I was not aware of the fact that I was bleeding. I was moderately intoxicated, and as I was walking out past the guard, who I would then walk all the way round to the front entrance of this house, which was the mess, the guard said, "Excuse me, sir, I think you're bleeding, you see." And I was bleeding from this penetrating wound. I've still got the scars here. And you know, I looked at the blood, keeled over, and fainted. So I became the first casualty since the war, and this was in late 1960s. And they hadn't had a casualty at the military hospital, which was opposite the mess, since the war. So I was taken to the hospital, and these retired generals were living off night calls which never existed. They get extra pay for doing night duty. And so I had a major general called out, retired, for an emergency to stitch me up, because I'd put the spike right through and pulled it off, and I've still got the scars there and there. And it was very Colonel Blimpish, this story, and so they stitched me up, I stopped bleeding, or thought I stopped bleeding, and then I went back to my little room in the mess. I was taken back by an ambulance, but I got up the stairs, and finally the alcohol and the blood loss put me to sleep, and when I woke up in the morning, I was lying in a nice puddle of blood, you see. Now, I knew you couldn't do this in the army without getting into a problem, you see. Cut a long story short, I had a job promised for me in London where I could go on doing my work. on vascular disease circulations in the Department of Medicine of the Royal Free Hospital or the Postgraduate Medical School, I'm not sure which it was. And I came up for interviews, and so you had to have two sources of interview. Where do you want to go? London. Second source, Hong Kong. You had to put down two postings. Why do you want to go to Hong Kong? Oh, I think I'm interested in tropical medicine. So I got the posting to Lagos, which was the punishment station of the British Army. 22 months, 10 miles inland from the coast, below sea level, 100% humidity with no air conditioning. And that was a very interesting time. But you didn't volunteer to go there. Well,
Survival.
it was interesting, actually. It was very interesting. Well, nobody volunteered to go there. It literally was. But it was very interesting medically because there were, it's difficult to be certain, but I was the qualified. There were two of us who had our higher degrees in medicine at the time, and the rest were people who volunteered because they wanted to do good or had done something wrong and were being sent there. But I had to look after the Governor General's parade of honor. Every Monday, Wednesday and Friday I'd have my little Jeep and my driver, and we'd drive down to the Governor General's palace in Lagos. We were about 10 miles inland below sea level, and Lagos is on a lagoon, and inspect these African soldiers who were part of the Royal West Africa Frontier Force, who later became the Nigerian military forces. And these guys were sort of, well, always in my belly do bite me sour, you see, and they wanted a day off to go home or something. It was a very dubious type of sick parade. So usually you just gave them something to empty their stomachs violently and they didn't come back. But occasionally there were people coming in who were really ill and nobody knew why, and usually they had associated this with some kind of spell that had been put on them. Now, I was also the medical officer in charge of the medical ward at the military hospital. That was my main job, because I had my membership and was already a qualified physician. And these people just died, wasted away and died. And I'm absolutely sure, and there's some proof that these people were the first cases of AIDS, actually, that we saw. There was a lot of work there in tropical medicine, published a bit on sickle cell anemia and malaria, but everybody had malaria. It wasn't very interesting. But these cases of soldiers who were convinced that somebody had put a spell on them, the witch doctor in the village, and they would be there and you went through everything they got and they just wasted away and died. And this was in 1957. So it was quite interesting. I think now the origin of the AIDS virus is located somewhere in that area of West Africa, and I'm pretty certain that we saw cases which we didn't realize were AIDS at the time. So that was interesting, and sickle cell anemia was interesting to study, and so it wasn't a totally wasted period of time, but 22 months in West Africa without air conditioning was interesting in many ways. It brought out all kinds of crazy reactions in people. It's not a healthy climate to live in.
3 minutes.
I found myself in a difficult situation with conflict with my professor for various reasons, in that we were getting more grant money and research money for what I was doing than she was doing, and this caused some disruption. And it was suggested to me that I left the field of hepatology and cardiovascular circulations that I was working in, and became interested in a new subject which was called nephrology. And so I went to the first International Congress of Nephrology in Evian and Geneva, and heard Dr. Scribner present his preliminary results on the use of dialysis technology for the prolongation of life in chronic renal failure in 1960. And when I came back to London, I thought it would be a good idea to try and do this. And so we started to do long-term dialysis as opposed to just acute dialysis for acute renal failure in 1961. And the impetus to have a European society that might amplify this work elsewhere in Europe came as a consequence of a meeting I had with a Dr. Drucker, who was interested in setting up an organization for some form of interaction between the few people in Europe who were interested in dialysis at this time for chronic purposes. And so we put together, after a meeting I held in London in 1963, a society that we thought we would call the West European Dialysis Association. And this society is, I think, was actually registered as WIDA, and there was a rival group at the Necker Hospital that were working under Professor Ombourget, which was not the transplant group, but the dialysis group, which was headed by a gentleman called Funk Brentano. And the idea of a West European Dialysis Association did not appeal to the French. And so, rather méchantly, I decided to add the T to the West European Dialysis Transformation and turn it into EDTA, which rolled off the tongue better and was the acronym for ethylene diamine tetracetic acid, and that's how it came about. We dared to put transplant together with dialysis, which did not please Professor Ombourget at all.
Why?
Well, he didn't want to be associated with dialysis doctors. You know, dialysis doctors were not on the same level as transplant doctors who were doing real work, you see. We were just mechanical jerks, you see. And so he wanted us to take the T out. And we refused. he was very annoyed, and one was no longer invited to the Necker Hospital for their meetings. And that's how EDTA came about. About 1964, I think it was, we started, and there was 3 of us. There was the Dutchman, who was Drucker, there was myself, and there was Kerr, who was a Scotsman working in the north of England. And we had the first meeting in 1964 in Amsterdam. Went very well.
How many people?
Oh, I don't know, a couple of hundred maybe. And not many French came to the first meeting. The Germans were quite interested. Of course, there were 2 Germanys at the time. We had a few West Germans. We struck up some relationships with Frankfurt at that time. And I can't remember the exact statistics, but they're down somewhere in the records. It was a small meeting but it was successful, 1964, and it went on from there. There was an Anglo-Saxon influence which didn't like the idea of DTA. They wanted this sort of applied type of lower class medicine to be subjugated to the higher class of pure renal physiology. And it took them a long time to get the era before the EDTA, when EDTA era, and finally era EDTA. But nobody talks about era EDTA, they always talk about EDTA because it's a nice, it rolls off the tongue in every language, and it's a nice acronym. But there was this society in England called the Renal Association, which is old, it goes right back, but these were micropuncture people doing renal physiology. They weren't basically, at that time, clinicians at all. And I think the concept of nephrology on a worldwide basis came in thanks to the French, though, the term nephrology. And that was Richet and Embouchet and Evian and Geneva. But it's interesting, although everybody calls it EDTA, it's actually era-EDTA. Why? You must ask whoever believes that it's necessary. I sometimes have my doubts as to whether, it was EDTA era for a few years, and then thought, well, we better make it a bit more classy. We'll call it era EDTA. But basically, if you look today at renal disease, it really wouldn't be very much without dialysis and transplantation. It would just be where it was 100 years ago. So, in a way, most people talk about EDTA today. Well, not really, no. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I think I preferred it when it was smaller. I mean, it's big business today, let's face it. I mean, governments spend a fortune, industry are clearly the ruling caste here, and when it was a small club, it was nicer. Now it's a big meeting, one of the biggest in the world, and it has spawned other copycats all over the world, you see. So we were original and probably far more successful than even the Americans when you get down to it. I mean, The clinical application of nephrology in dialysis is much stronger, in my opinion, in Europe than it is in America. You had the micropuncture dominance of the American Society of Nephrology, which started several years after, I think, the starting of the EDTA. They've always managed to keep the applied therapies under control, whilst the micropuncture people dominated the pure science of it in a rather snobby sort of way. But it's changing as well, I think. The money isn't in the experimental work. We're certainly becoming an independent specialty in its own right. It's no longer, I think, anywhere in the world attached to cardiology or hypertension independently. I think it is a recognized and successful specialty that attracts different people for different reasons, between the people who go into it purely from the academic and experimental point of view to the people who go into it to make money. And I think it's one of the, compared to cardiology or gastroenterology or the more classical, it's a relatively young field, nephrology, and I think it's does very well now in terms of its achievements, and has an ever-increasing number of trained doctors who are nephrologists, and I think this is a great success. It took a long time, considering that the kidney been around as long as the heart and the liver and the gut and the brain, but I think it must be one of the youngest specialties that have been so successful, and it's clearly growing in numbers of adherents. This meeting is getting bigger and bigger. The American Society of Nephrology meeting has changed its focus from being pure micropuncture experimental to the more clinical applications, because that's where the money is. It's a tricky one. I think, you know, the dream that dialysis will become the insulin diabetic has failed. Therefore, you have got a sanatorium type of chronic dialysis patient today, particularly, if you will, the younger population that are successfully transplanted get better rehabilitated, and you're left with a geriatric population who live and die, and it becomes extremely limiting intellectually. I think you have to be some kind of highly motivated human being to continue in that type of approach, or you're in it for the money. Yes, a bit cynical, that's right. The days of proprietary dialysis units arrived with our, I remember very well the days when they arrived in America. I set up one myself, as I think I told you, when I left the National Health Service. And you could make a lot of money out of it if you were clever. You reused the products, and it's still going on, of course, whether it's a good thing or not. In fact, I think we were the first to reuse dialyzers, actually. The industry didn't like it. I can remember being courted by Travenor long before Kiel came along and asked not to reuse their dialyzers. I think I was the first person to reuse them. It was economically the only way we could dialyze in those days, because we were rationed by the hospital in how many dialyzers we could have, and they thought this would prevent us from increasing our population. But we reused the dialyzers without the permission of the hospital, and were able to increase our population. And then when we got controlled by my professor, we used to have to hide the patients so she wouldn't know how many we had at the Royal Free Hospital. But that's all gone now. It's all. But there were definitely moral reasons for doing it, as well as financial. But it's never. It has not fulfilled its dialysis. Has not fulfilled its dream. It's not the insulin of the chronic nephritic. Freedom.
Freedom.
I think it's very difficult today to have an original idea. I think instant access to knowledge through the internet has changed the way people think, changed the way they do research. And if you're clever at using search engines and can find odd papers that are published by obscure individuals and know how to exploit a good idea, you can have an original idea that isn't really original and get away with it for a long time. And I suspect that a lot of research is done that way today. I think that it's difficult to be original today, have original thought. And it's also true that people who are involved in dialysis as a full-time medical occupation are really the successors of the chronic TB doctors. That's what they are. And this is not intellectually satisfying, but it can be very rewarding financially. What do I like besides medicine? Well, these days I don't like medicine at all. What do I like? I swim. I like swimming a lot. I go swimming every day for about, thanks to a skiing injury, I have a problem with the knee. I can actually swim further every day than I can walk because I get pain in the leg on my knee, which limits my walking distance, whereas I can swim as, we go swimming every day for about a couple of hours in the sea all the year round. Only the medusae are the threats. You get bitten. I got bitten last week here. You see, there's a little bite. But with a nice hood on, you are protected. So swimming is... I used to play water polo as well. That was an interesting game as well. And a bit of rugby. But swimming is what I do most now. In the sea. All year round. I think I'm the wandering Jew. Seriously. Now I don't really have I left the United Kingdom because I couldn't get a job there. I was banned. when I finally got fed up with dialysis, that I must say that dialysis is not as interesting as being a TB officer before streptomycin came in. It is a repetitive, boring job, and I think anybody with a few grey cells gets bored with repetitive work. And so when I wanted to go back into academic medicine, I tried to get back into English medicine. I couldn't get a job. So I packed my bags and went to Montpellier, where I got a visiting professorship. Liked it, so I stayed there. But I never felt French. Montpellier is a very tolerant city. It's known, you know, for welcoming foreigners. The university is very tolerant, unlike certain French universities. It has a tradition of tolerance, Montpellier. The medical school is one of the oldest in Europe, you know, in Montpellier. And I went from Montpellier as a visiting professor to work for the rest of my academic career in Nîmes. Well, it's nice to be able to travel around without a passport. You know, we wander from France to Italy to Austria, Czechoslovakia. But they're all different. It's a union, but it's not. I think the cultures are all different. But I think it's. You can't really say it's like America with different states. I think it's far too individualistically, and the language differences are enormous. But it makes for an easier life. I think you shouldn't go into this believing you're going to save the human race. I think it's a worthwhile profession if you are motivated for some reason or curious for some reason, but it's a demanding profession. And it requires a lot of effort to succeed in. It's competitive, but the glamour of it, or the respect for being a physician these days, I think, has gone. I think it's just another profession. You could be a lawyer, you could be an accountant, you happen to be a doctor. The human race has now reached a level of they need doctors when they've got a problem, but whether in fact they have the respect they used to have, I don't know. I'm not really able to judge, but I have the impression that you use your doctor because you have a need for it. Whether you respect your doctor because you have a need for it, I can't answer that question. I think it's gone down in society, the value of being a doctor. It's my impression. Well, it certainly can be rewarding financially if you go into private nephrology practice, by which I mean dialysis. I think you can still end up earning more money than by doing something else in medicine. It's a pretty easy route to having a reasonably high income in the medical profession without having to do too much work and without having to be too intelligent.
And if one is intelligent?
I think you wouldn't do it because you'd be bored stiff. I mean, it's worse than being a tuberculosis officer. Sorry. You better cut that bit out.
Maybe we should. And do you think that art has a role in medicine?
Art. Well, I like to. I like to believe that it does. I think medicine, if you look on it purely as a didactic, scientific subject, is wrong. I think medicine does involve an interreaction of humans, clinical medicine. If you're an experimental animal doctor, then we're not talking about it. But clinical medicine, you're dealing with human beings, and I think that contact is rewarding to the doctor, and therefore attractive for those who feel that there is something a bit more in their work than just, you know, doing a lab job and a bench job. But I think it's changing though a lot. I think the legal demands, the pressures, the costs are taking away from the individual doctor a lot of his time for personal contacts, which he would establish with a limited number of patients in chronic disease, therapies, whatever they are, whether it's tuberculosis or chronic dialysis. I don't know, it's very difficult to answer that question. I don't practice medicine anymore, I'm out of touch, so you're asking me opinions that you need to ask somebody who perhaps isn't as old as I am. I don't know if it's